Okay, Jade.
An interesting one this week, Joe, that you've suggested.
Yeah, so I was like, I'm kind of enjoying this, like learning about stuff at the moment. So with the table of knowledge, I know in the past we've always talked about topics I've got a pretty good understanding of. But last week we talked about Bernie Madoff, who I had heard of, but sort of vaguely, mainly more in all honesty, I think I heard of him in relation to Melissa Kadich than anything else. I had heard of Charles Ponzi because of Ponzi schemes, but I didn't know anything about him. So I was like, let's look for some more interesting scam stories. And I came up with this character called Victor Lustig. Now, he is an interesting character. I've been really researching him over the last few days. What's he famous for, Jade?
So Victor Lustig is famous for selling the Eiffel Tower.
This guy has got balls, let me tell you. Well, he did. He's dead now, so he probably doesn't have anything anymore. But he was born in 1890, so we're talking about like the 1920s. We're not going to go too much into the history of his life because he, like I said, it's actually, if you want to listen to some podcasts about it, there's lots of information about him. And also, realistically, with a lot of the history of his life, no one actually knows if any of it's true because he's such a con artist that actually no one has any idea really where he was born, what's true. So they do believe he was born in Austria, in Bohemia, in Austria-Hungary. So I think that's now would be considered the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
Again, they're not really sure. They believe he was born into a fairly poor family, into poverty, which is kind of apparently with these con artists, that's quite normal that they come from a fairly,
lower
poor
class
existence. But he has told people that his, father was the mayor of the town and like there's all sorts of stories. So who knows? But anyway, this guy, Victor Lustig, he went by the name of Count Victor Lustig, so he'd given himself a title. And he started scamming really early in life, first of all on liners, on ships.
Yeah, exactly right. So he was approaching the rich travellers that were on these ships, and he posed as a musical producer. So he pretended to be that, and he was looking for investment from these rich travellers for a non-existent Broadway production. So he was kind of saying to them, I've got this production, would you like to invest, when it really never existed at all.
Yeah, I believe he was also a big card player and he was very, very good at scamming people for card games as well. So I know that's not in the article that you've read, Jay, but because I've been listening to many podcasts about him, I will add some. So, yeah, he was, I guess it kind of brings back memories of Titanic. The character that Leonardo DiCaprio played, I'm pretty sure he was a bit of a scammer, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, I haven't watched it for a while. But anyway, but this guy, because he was French, he spoke French, and he apparently had interpreters and everything, and he, named himself Count, so he probably sounded like he was pretty important.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
Sounded like a, important person.
Yeah, he had an interpreter, like he must be important. Anyway, so he did that for a few years, going from New York to back over to Europe, scamming people along the way. I think that was a bit of a high for people to scam people because you were trapped on a ship, you had all your money with you, and then by the time the ship docked, you could disappear and start all over again.
Right. By the time that the people found out they'd been scammed, you were gone.
Yeah. But then what happened was the war got in the way, World War I, and so no one was really getting, going across on the transatlantic. It wasn't very safe to do that. And so he then ended up, I think because he got, nearly caught a few times, I think he was arrested over his life something like 40-something times, right?
Crazy.
And he always seemed to manage to scam his way out of it. But anyway, he ended up going back over to France in 1925, and this is when he did his biggest scam, which is the one we're going to talk about, which is the Eiffel Tower one.
Yeah, it's actually quite, I don't want to say funny, but it really
is.
it's quite funny.
I can't believe we don't have any movies about it.
Yeah, Yeah, maybe that's a good idea, Joe. Maybe you should start a movie. But yeah, so this is where probably his most famous con or scam is where he managed to sell the Eiffel Tower. So in 1925, while he was staying in Paris, there were a heap of newspaper articles that were discussing the problems that Paris or France were having in maintaining the Eiffel Tower. So they were kind of saying that the Eiffel Tower is falling into despair. It's costing a lot of money to keep it maintained.
Yeah. Now, the Eiffel Tower was actually built in 1880, I think it was, or around that time. It was built for the World Expo. So for those of you who are older than you, Jade, you would remember Expo 88 up in Brisbane, where we all went and spent a couple of days looking around. But they've been around for a long time. So the Eiffel Tower was actually built for the World Expo in 1880, I think it was. So it was apparently only ever really meant to be temporary in the first instance. They thought they were only meant to have it there for about 20 years. And by the 1920s, it had been used quite well in the war because they could actually use it to put some radios things up the top of the tower. But it was sort of falling into disrepair. It was costing a lot of money for the public for taxpayers to maintain it. So there was this undercurrent, why do we have it? Let's get rid of it. And that's where he got this great idea that, how about I just sell it?
Exactly right. So, and it is quite clever the way that
he's very clever, this guy.
Yeah, the way that he's done this. So I don't want to say that I admire his cleverness because it is a big scam, but it really is, he goes to a lot of effort for these scams.
So what he did was he got a forger, first of all, to create some stationery and made himself a title of the Deputy Director of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, which apparently was a title he came up with because it sounded very official, but it was vague enough to not really mean anything.
Yeah, so you hear that and it sounds really important. And like you said, Joe, he got all of this stationery created. So it was government stationery. So it had all of, the proper logos and whatnot on it. So it looked really official.
Yeah. So then what he did was he invited 5 businessmen who were involved in essentially iron scrapping, like metal scrapping. So into this very, very private and confidential meeting, which he had at a hotel. And with that, he basically buttered them up a bit and told them that he picked them because they're very honest businessmen and there's a very secret project happening, and then proceeded to tell them what the project was.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, during these meetings, he kind of had his eye on one person that he thought would be the one to fall for the scam. So he kind of judged the 5 of them and had his eye on this one person called Andre Poisson, I believe. How you say it, I'll do my best French accent. So he kind of believed that he was a bit of an insecure man who wished to rise up. So he could see that he wanted the wealth, really.
Yeah, and when you hear the stories about Victor Lustig, he was very good at identifying a lot of, the most vulnerable people for this sort of stuff. He actually apparently thought of himself as a little bit of a Robin Hood, although I don't know if that actually was the thing he believed. But his whole philosophy was that he wanted to rob the rich. He didn't really create scams on people who were not wealthy. He just wanted to rob rich people. But he didn't give to the poor. He gave to himself. So there wasn't quite the Robin Hood thing there. But anyway, so he did pick, what he did was he said to these 5 businessmen, this is the deal, is that we're trying to sell this. We want you to put a proposal to us. What we're going to do is you tell us how much you're going to pay and then you can scrap the metal. You have to bring it down. You have to do all the work, but you just pay the government some money. They will give you the opportunity to do all of this. So then he said, look, go away, give us your proposals and we'll review the proposals and we'll talk to the person that we want to take on. Now, as Jade said, he'd already picked his target, so he really didn't care what the proposals said. He'd worked out by dealing with these people, apparently even took them. So he took them to the Eiffel Tower. He gave them a tour of it. He had a government badge. He flashed it at all the security people. So he looked so much the part that even the security people didn't know that he wasn't a government official.
It's funny because it's like it's clever, but it's also so simple. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's just mind-blowing, really.
Yeah. So then when Andre Poisson was told, like, you know, that he was the winner, he had already said that he was going to pay 70,000 francs, which at the time was quite a significant amount of money. And then, so when, again, apparently the commonplace thing was when you dealt with the government in France at the time, the government officials would always want a bribe. So apparently the thing that actually got him across the line, because he did doubt it a bit apparently, but when Victor Lustig sort of indicated that he's a poor public servant and made the whole play, you know, I'm not very rich and maybe some money would help, that kind of was what got this Andre across the line to think it was genuine.
Yeah.
So not only did he pay the 73,000 francs, he also he paid the bribe, I think, which maybe, I'm not sure exactly how much that was, to Victor as well.
Yeah. Now, Victor Lustig was also of the mindset that when Poisson found out that it was a scam and that he'd been conned, he would be too embarrassed to actually report it or tell the police that he got scammed and conned. And he was right. He didn't report it.
That's right. So they fled. Him and he had a guy who helped him who I can't remember the guy's name, but there was another guy involved in it, Danny Dapper Danny or something. Anyway, they went over to Austria for, I think, about a month, eagerly watching the newspapers to find out when the scam had come out. And it didn't. So he then got so brazen that he actually went back and tried to do it again.
Exactly. Ballsy.
So he went back, used the same stationery that he had, called another meeting for some more different, I'm guessing different people. You would get different people this time. And unfortunately for Victor, the guy who did win the bid and he tried to scam actually worked out that was the case. So he didn't manage to sell it twice. He did try to sell it twice.
He still sold the Eiffel Tower once,
yeah. And he then fled to the US so that he would evade being arrested. Now, that was a brazen one. This other one I loved as well. So he also had this other scam that he would do. So I think his whole life was about being a con man and just scamming money out of people. But he had this thing called the Romanian box. Do you want to talk about this?
I will. This one's actually quite a funny one, I think.
I think it's hilarious.
So what the Romanian box was it was a box that he was scamming people with, and it had he basically said that if you put a note in this box, like $100 note, wait a few hours, it will produce an exact replica. So basically you can double your money.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not true. That doesn't happen. But it was he planned it out so well. So what people would do is they'd put $100 in, they'd wait a few hours, they'd get their second $100 note. So they'd essentially have $200. He would take them to the bank and the bank would say, yep, this note's legit. The one that popped out is legit. And he would try and sell the box to them and say, you can just put money in and then legit money prints. That was, of course, not the case.
Yeah. So what he was doing originally was he was the one who'd put the money in. He would go to the bank, he would get a couple of $100 notes. So in sequential order, he would then somehow manage to just slightly change that last number so that it looked, and when they went to the bank don't look at serial numbers, so they're just going, I'm guessing they don't go, do these look legit? They probably went to bank them, and the bank people, because forgery and not forgery, what do you call it, money creation, forgery I guess it is, was ripe at that stage. Counterfeit money was just all over the place, so the bank people would always been looking out for it. But of course it wasn't forged because it was actually a real note.
Exactly right.
So the stories he had, so he would sell these things for about $10,000. He also said that it took 6 hours for the thing to be created. So you would put the money in, you would put some special chemicals into the box, you'd turn some knobs, and you had to do them in a very certain order and all this sort of stuff. And then 6 hours later, this new note would come out with the old note, so you'd be doubling your money. Now, I guess the other perfect part about this is that the people who were doing it couldn't really report it because they were trying to counterfeit money themselves.
Exactly. So again, a very clever scam because the people that you're scamming are not going to report it.
No, there was a story about, I loved this one. So at one stage he was arrested for something, which he seemed to be always getting arrested, and he was in this jail, I think it was in Texas, and the sheriff or whatever he was, I think it was sheriff, he was like sort of befriended him because this guy was just such a great scammer. He listened to people and he was trying to find something. Anyway, so he worked out that this sheriff, after many conversations, was actually taking money because he was apparently meant to collect the taxes for the community. He was taking money and it was actually being used to look after his mistress and his second home, essentially. So he sort of said to him, well, I've got this thing, this Romanian box that makes money. And he got him to go and get it because he couldn't get out of jail. So he got him to go and get it. He showed him and he said, look, if you can have this for $10,000, but only if you let me out. So he let him out and he took off, of course. Now, this guy was a bit cranky because obviously and he'd go like, you have to wait 6 hours, it won't, like, you know, and then once it's done at once, you've got to wait another 12 hours before you try and do it again. So he had all these like stories as to delay time to get him away. So anyway, he found him, he caught up with him, and apparently this guy found him, had a gun pointed to him, and Victor said, like, well, did you do it properly? Did you do it in the right order? I think you might have broken it, like, and da-da-da-da-da. Like, I don't know why it didn't work. But he said, here, I'll give you back your $10,000. So he did, but it was actually counterfeit money. And so when this guy went to bank it, he got arrested for for trading counterfeit money. So he was great.
He could talk himself out of any situation, clearly.
Yeah. So that was one pretty impressive scam. Now, what about Al Capone?
Scarface. This is a ballsy one. You have to be ballsy to scam Al Capone.
Now, apparently this was more, to be honest, just a challenge for him. He didn't really care if he made much money out of it at all. He just wanted to see if he could scam like the most feared mafia boss / whatever in the world.
And he did.
And he did. So do you want to talk about what he did there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was during the Great Depression, so during that time. And what he did was he actually asked Al Capone to invest $50,000 in, a scheme that was a scam, of course. And what Al Capone did, he gave him the money. And what he did was he put the money in a safe deposit box for 2 months. So the money was still there. He didn't do anything with it. And he actually gave it back to Al Capone and said that the deal had fallen through. Here's your $50,000 back.
Yeah. Now, apparently, his original promise was that the $50,000 would double because he had this special investment that he was going to do. He never had any intention of doing that. When after 6 weeks he hadn't returned the money, that's when Al Capone's henchmen went and found him, took him to Al Capone, and he said, "Look, I have the money for you. I'm just really embarrassed. I didn't get to create the extra double or whatever that I'd promised, but here's your money back." And so essentially he was just doing it to create trust between him and Al Capone.
And so Al Capone thought, oh, well, I'm dealing with a really honest man here, a good guy.
Yeah, he's a really honest man. And then he proceeded to tell him that because the investment fell through, he had no money, he was really poor, and so Al Capone then gave him $5,000.
Yeah. So really what his whole scam was to convince Al Capone that he was a good guy and then make him feel sorry for him. Yeah. And it worked.
Yeah. Now what he actually got caught for in the end was he was a massive he did have this massive counterfeiting operation going on with this guy called Watts. He was William Watts. William Watts was actually the forger for Al Capone, so I think that was through that relationship that he met him. And for about 5 years, they were just pumping huge amounts of counterfeit money into the US economy. It was actually at the point where it was potentially going to impact the economy because there was so much going into it. And they had these special templates that they'd created that not only So normally when you counterfeit money, apparently, because I don't know so much about this, it would just look, you wouldn't have those, how we have those special lines and whatever in it. Well, I mean, we're talking 1920s. They actually had like a blue and red line that went through the notes. Now, usually when people counterfeit money, they counterfeit smaller notes because they they don't put those in there, and shopkeepers aren't necessarily going to look for that. But what they did was they'd actually had templates. So they did the first thing and then they did a second one to put those lines in there, which meant that they went through the banks and the banks didn't notice them either. So they were actually able to make the larger denominations, like the $100 notes. So they'd been doing this for quite a while and making huge amounts of money out of it. And eventually apparently they've been like trying to investigate where it was coming from. And eventually they caught him. I think it was actually that he was dobbed in by his mistress. So Billy May, her name was. Anyway, he went to jail. Oh, no, he didn't. He was being held. He was being held by the police. They were trying to, get information out of him. And what he did was he said, look, I'll give you the keys to my secret spot where I have the templates. And he did give them that on the proviso. He thought that he was going to get away with it because he was such a scammer. So he gave them the keys. They went to this locker, got out these templates, but it was the old ones that they'd used, so they weren't the good ones. And some money was there and everything as well, of course. So this didn't sort of really fly. And eventually they did end up catching up with this William Watts through various investigations and found all of the money. William Watts did then just dob him in and basically said he was probably like the Sam Bankman-Fried thing at the moment where all of his co-workers just went, well, we'll just throw you under the bus and save ourselves. So he did that. Next thing, while he was in jail, let's talk about the Great Escape.
He escaped from jail, which we were having a good giggle about this yesterday.
So he was in some penitentiary that was like in the city, and so it was like a building. The outdoor yard was on the roof of the building. So when they go out, to do their exercise, they'd go up on the roof and what have you. Anyway, over a few months, he'd been collecting bed sheets and made ropes out of them. On this particular day, he decided he wasn't feeling well, and so he managed to go back to his room, then managed to throw the rope out the window, climbed down it. Apparently people didn't sort of think about the fact that it was a penitentiary. They'd look up and see this guy, and every time someone looked up, he'd have a rag and he was like pretending to wash the windows.
So people would just go, oh, it's just the window.
Yeah. Until he got to the bottom and then he took off.
Quite funny, really.
But they did finally catch up with him. He ended up getting convicted to 15 years for the counterfeiting of their money and another 5 years for for the escape of jail.
So he was in Alcatraz.
So they decided this time they're not going to risk anything. So he ended up in Alcatraz. So he ended up being over there. He passed away not too much longer after that. I think he was there for a few years and then he got sick and he died of pneumonia.
Yeah. So he died in 1947.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing was what they put on his death certificate is his occupation.
Yeah. So on his death certificate, his occupation was listed as apprentice salesman.
The other thing he's a little bit famous for is what's known as the 10 Commandments of con men. And that apparently they don't know if it was him, but he certainly lived by this and they do sort of credit him for that. So here are the 10 Commandments of con men. Do you want to start with the first one?
Sure. So the first one is be a patient listener. It is this, not talking fast, that gets a con man his coups.
Never look bored.
Wait for the other person to reveal any political opinions, then agree with them.
Let the other person reveal religious views, then have the same ones.
Hint at sex talk, but don't follow it up unless the other person shows a strong interest.
Never discuss illness unless some special concern is shown.
Never pry into a person's personal circumstances. They'll tell you all eventually.
Never boast, just let your importance be quietly obvious.
Never be untidy.
And never get drunk.
Makes sense, really, doesn't it?
It does. Anyway, so I really enjoyed listening and finding out about this guy. So if you are interested, I mean, his name is Victor Lustig. If you Google him, there's plenty of podcasts about him. There's plenty of stories about him. There's actually a book called The Man Who Sold the Eiffel Tower, which I might have a read of actually.
He's a very interesting man, very
Yeah.
clever man, really.
Yeah.